Welcome to our first episode of the Feminine Strength Podcast, where we are covering how women can build muscle and lose fat simultaneously, even over the age of 40, or even if you're nearing the age of 40. So the Feminine Strength Podcast is a podcast where we are sharing innovative strategies for women to help them sustainably build a strong and fit body while supporting their hormonal health and improving their nervous system resilience. I am your host, Jess Mather. I'm a strength and rehab professional with over 14 years of experience working with thousands of clients around the world to help them feel happier, healthier, and stronger in their body. So in this episode, we are covering losing fat and building muscle. And why I chose this episode to start with is because at the time I'm recording this episode, it is January 2025. And typically we see that people rolling into the new year want to have some new fitness challenges. They might want to change their body, their physique. So we're going to start here in this episode. It's about changing our body, our physique, so that we can look better and feel better. So if you are over 40 or nearing the age of 40 and you have a goal to get toned, is what I often hear. So what that means is usually just losing fat and gaining muscle, a toned look. This episode is going to help clarify how to do that in a sustainable and manageable way while also supporting your hormonal and metabolic health. Very important. So before we hop into the meat and potatoes of this episode, I thought of this fun idea the other day that every episode I'm going to sneak in a secret word. You have to listen for this secret word. And if you listen to at least 8 episodes of this podcast and keep a tab of what those secret words are, we'll automatically give you 10% off the comprehensive feminine strength training and nutrition program. So I will be sharing a secret word today. You're welcome to write it down. Keep that word. Listen to the next episode, keep tabs of that word, and then once you've collected 8, we will give you 10% off, which depending on the level that you come in feminine strength, that could be hundreds of dollars in savings. So listen up for a secret word today. All right, so on the topic of losing fat and gaining muscle after the age of 40 or around the age of 40. So what I wanted to cover first are some strategies that I've seen a lot of women do that are now outdated. We know better now. The evidence pointed to it a while back, but what we're learning about evidence and research in the nutrition and the training space is a lot of that research was done on men. And we are different than men, right? Biologically and physiologically, we are different than men. So now, thank goodness, we're finally starting to see more research coming out for women. So the things that we used to do, one, might not have even been backed up by anything. We just might have been marketed to do these certain things by companies. And two, that these studies were often done, again, on men, so they weren't as applicable to women. So let's look at these outdated strategies or strategies that aren't just going to be as effective for getting you to that toned body. These are all things that I have personally done as well, and we learn and we grow. So the few strategies I see that, again, are outdated, not working as well, are going to be number 1, intermittent fasting. Now, when I say these strategies, it doesn't mean completely 100%, they're all terrible, but in general, these aren't going to be the best option for you. So intermittent fasting, we see women particularly who really extend their fasting window, so they're pushing off breakfast until like noon, 1 o'clock, and usually all they're eating, well, they're not eating anything, but all they're drinking is coffee. So they're waking up in the morning, they're drinking coffee, they're having a stimulant, and then they're not eating until noon or 1 p.m. What we see is that for women, we're more sensitive to that calorie restriction in the morning, and that it can actually be more stressful for our body to experience that. The other thing that we will then compound on it is then we wake up in the morning, we lift weights, or we do some sort of strenuous exercise, we drink coffee, and then we still push off eating until noon or 1. So that again can be a little bit more harsh on our bodies than, say, a man. Where it can work really well for a male is that he can wake up in the morning and he can not eat and drink some coffee and lift weights and be fine. But for women, because of our hormones, the sensitivity that our brain and our body have to calorie restriction and our blood sugar levels, that we would actually do better eating and fueling beforehand. And as we continue in this episode, I'm going to go over strategies that do actually help and strategies that we can do instead of these as we move forward. The next thing we see is the whole low carb keto train, and I did low carb for a very long time. It can be very therapeutic for the right populations. However, when it comes to building that strong and fit body where we actually want to fuel muscle growth, that carbohydrate can actually be really helpful. So I almost never put clients on a keto or low carb diet. It's really not necessary, and carbs are wonderful. So why would we want to cut them out if it's not necessary, right? The next thing we see is the extensive cardio. So Orange Theory is really popular right now. We see spin classes. Not to say that doing cardio and being engaged in fitness activities are bad, but when it comes to building that strong and fit body, getting that healthy physique, it's not going to be the most effective strategy. So we see women just going to these fitness classes and wondering why their body isn't changing favorably in the way that they want. There's reasons why that is. There's better ways to do it. We also see women going to these, I call it high rep pump classes. So Tracy Anderson classes come to mind, where you're using lower weights, like a 3 pound, 5, 8, even 10 pound weights, very, very high reps. These also aren't going to be the best strategy to really build that muscle. We need to get a big hormonal boost in order to make the adaptations to get that fit body, and doing these higher rep pump classes just aren't giving that stimulus to the body. The other thing we see, we are not bringing into 2025, are the very low calorie diets, chronic dieting. I've seen so many women come in, when we look at their calories, they're actually under eating, but they still want to lose weight. We'll talk about this in more detail later on in this episode, but when I see a woman who comes in and they're already under eating, we really can't put them in a deficit, because then we're not able to actually see their body build and grow. We need to have adequate fuel in order to build, literally build, a fit body. The other thing we see is a poor protein intake. So what I've seen, if women are not being conscious of how much protein that they're eating, if they're not intentional about eating more protein, they'll usually end up only getting about 50 to 60 grams a day, which is just going to be too low to build muscle. So we see a poor protein intake. We see women doing the same routine over and over again, or maybe they're making very small modifications and changes to it. We see women following YouTube videos out there, but they're generally pretty random, and they're not giving them a clear plan of how to progress. This is really, really important, and we'll talk about that in more detail later on in this episode, is the progressive aspect of training to make sure that we are building and we can track that. And lastly, the strategy that is not working, never worked, is overstressing our bodies, especially as we're going through all these hormonal changes. We really want to make sure that we're doing the right amount of exercise at the right time, the right amount of food, fueling properly, the right amount of protein, making sure we're recovering properly, because we can't get away with the same things that we did when we were 20, right? So we want to make sure that we're taking care of our body in a different way, that the weightlifting and the exercise we're doing is not depleting. So the right exercise, the right nutrition at the right time, and the right amounts. So when we're talking about losing fat and building muscle, what we're referring to is a body recomposition. You might have heard me say that before, a body recomposition. That means we're changing the ratio between muscle and fat in the body. So for some women, I've seen them come in and they're pretty happy with their weight. They don't feel like they have a lot of weight to lose, but they want to change that ratio. They want that body recomposition. So their weight stays relatively the same, but that ratio changes so their body looks very different, even though their weight is the same. Then we see some women come in who want to lose 15, 20, 25 pounds. They want to decrease their body fat even more, and that's going to drive their weight down, but they're still getting that body recomp because that ratio is still changing. They're still putting on that muscle. A body recomposition will give that toned look. However, it can be harder to make these body recomposition changes after the age of 40. it can be harder. And we're going to look at what those changes are, why it is harder for women going into perimenopause, and what we can do about it, or what we can do despite it. That even though these changes are happening, we are going through these hormonal changes, we can still change things. We can still make progress. We can still get to our goal and our outcome. It's just we have to be very specific, and we have to understand what's working against us. Okay, we are going to cover a few things that our body goes through once we are around the perimenopause age. And then again, we're going to go over what we can do to counteract those things. So just a few things here. This is not a comprehensive list of all of the changes that happen to us as we go through life and age as women, but these are the big pieces that really make a difference. Number one, of course, is our decline in estrogen levels. So estrogen plays a critical role in body fat distribution. So where we might have fat stored more in our hips, in our booty, that fat distribution can change, and then we can start to store fat in our belly, which obviously isn't usually our preference. Estrogen also supports muscle strength, repair, and function. So with a decline of estrogen, we also see a higher risk of muscle loss, which is why it's very important, regardless of your physique goals, to build muscle and lift weights when we're going through perimenopause, because with that decline of estrogen, we're naturally going to start to accelerate that muscle loss. Number two, insulin sensitivity. So with decreased estrogen, what can happen is we can actually impair the body's ability to use insulin effectively, and we become more insulin resistant. We want to be insulin sensitive, not insulin resistant, but that decrease in estrogen messes things up a little bit. So when we become more insulin resistant, we can have unhealthy fat storage. So we call it more visceral fat, and again, more in the belly. Fun. So this poor insulin sensitivity also plays a role in our gym performance or our lifting performance. So it can make it harder for glucose to get into the muscles for energy. So therefore, we're not able to work as hard. And when it comes to changing our physique, we want to make sure that we're performing well. So we don't want this insulin resistance. Number three is increase in cortisol levels. So as we talked about before, we don't want to overstress the body. Our body is going through a lot of different changes. The other thing in our 40s, I don't think that's appreciated enough, is once we hit our 40s, our parents might be aging, we might be having to take care of our parents, which can be stressful. Maybe we're going through a divorce, our kids are leaving the house, going to college, maybe we have a career change, maybe we've started dealing with some major health issues. So the 40s, that decade can be stressful in and of itself, not to mention all of these hormonal changes. So we want to always be sensitive to our overall capacity, right? The other thing is we can have sleep disturbances from these changes in hormones. So we're not recovering properly, we don't have as much energy throughout the day. We can see a change in neurotransmitters because of these hormonal changes in serotonin, dopamine, melatonin. And then as we see this elevation in cortisol, we see more fat storage in, again, the belly, and we see more muscle breakdown, muscle loss. The other thing that starts to change is a decline in testosterone. Really important. Often the conversation around T or testosterone is about men, but it's very important that women have testosterone as well, and healthy levels of T. T helps regulate metabolism and fat distribution as well. So if you have a decline in testosterone, which naturally tends to happen as we go through perimenopause, we are more prone to storing fat. You can see this pattern here of how losing fat and building muscle is actually the opposite of what our body naturally wants to do, right? So a decline in T and testosterone, of course, hinders our ability to build and maintain muscle mass. Number 5, our thyroid, of course, our funny little thyroid. So the thyroid helps regulate our metabolism. Changes in our other hormones can impact the thyroid. We can get a slower metabolism, especially as we begin to deal with muscle loss, or if we haven't been lifting throughout our 20s and 30s, and that muscle loss is occurring. We also see that decline in metabolism. And lastly, I won't go on and on about these changes, but lastly, we see a reduction in human growth hormone and IGF-1 levels. These hormones also help regulate the metabolism, Lower levels of these hormones can reduce our fat burning capacity, and also we might have a slower muscle recovery. We are working against a lot of physiological and biological changes as we go through our 40s, right? We're literally working against changes that want us to go in the opposite direction, right? The other thing with perimenopause too, we don't want to forget, is that our cycle can be changing, right? We might have more fatigue, more mood changes, our motivation really changes. We can be suffering from anxiety and depression, which can also disrupt our ability to stay focused on our workouts, to stay consistent. All right, we covered a lot of bleak things, but despite all of these changes that we go through, and every woman will go through different levels of it, it'll impact us all a little bit differently, we do have more control than we might think. Okay, so despite all of these things, we have more control than what we might think. We need to be really consistent, and we need to have the right strategy. Consistency and the right strategy. We can't wing it like we might have been able to do in our 20s or 30s when our body was responding a little bit more easily because we had our hormones on our side. All right, I'm going to pause right here and give the secret word of this episode. The secret word of this episode is hamburger. Like the food that you eat, hamburger. The secret word is hamburger. All right, so let's get into the strategy now for how we want to approach this. How then do we still get a toned, strong, fit body even after the age of 40? So here's a step-by-step little formula here. First, we want to make sure we check how much you're actually eating. So as we get older and the metabolism can start to slow slightly, we want to check first, how much are you eating? Are you eating a little bit too much now? Is that why you're storing fat? We want to look at how much you're actually eating. What are your maintenance calories? This is really, really important. And then on that point, is this enough food? Right? Have you been trying to diet for long periods of time where you're actually now under eating, where you're not fueling enough, where the metabolism has slowed down too much because there's not enough fuel coming in? So we want to get a baseline. So tracking your food in some sort of calorie counter. One of my clients said ChatGPT can even work to start counting your calories, and you can just tell ChatGPT, this is what I ate, how many calories is this, how many grams of protein, et cetera, et cetera. Or you could use something like MyFitnessPal, Fat Secret, I think one is called Chronometer. So you can get an idea of what you're actually eating. There's so much information here. There's so much data there. Just looking at what am I actually consuming, okay? We want to start there. Then we can look at, is this enough food? So usually what I use is a calculator, online calculator called Health Calc. So Health Calculator. The website is health-calc.com. I like this one because it's really easy to modify the activity level and be as specific as possible. And then we have a general idea of how much you should be consuming, and then we can match that to what you actually are eating. So if you are under eating, then that's a whole nother strategy. We would want to do something called a refeed. So you start to refeed calories. I personally used to maintain my weight at 1,400 calories a day. Now I maintain my weight closer to 2,400 calories a day, and I weigh less, and I do a little bit less work. It's just a matter of going really slow, using the right training. So if you do notice that you're eating significantly less than what, say, an online calculator says you should for your activity level, we would want to go into a refeed instead of just putting you into a deficit because you're already eating too little, if we really want to make sure you're building a fit body, okay? So the other thing is, if you are eating above what that Health Calc says, and you're eating like 3,000 calories a day, and it says, oh, you should maintain your weight at 2,500 a day, well, that's great. I actually love when the women coming in, they're either eating at a good maintenance calorie or they're eating above. That means we have more wiggle room to actually get into a deficit. I will say that is the majority of cases. The majority of cases are women are eating enough food, but I mentioned the ones that might not be because it's that critical. It can really be, like, make or break your results. So if you are eating at a really good level, you're fueling yourself, I like to start somewhere with a 10 to 20% deficit of calories and being really diligent in that deficit. Usually when I see women saying, I can't lose weight, the weight's really stubborn, we see that they've never really been tracking how much they're eating, they're not being really diligent. We don't always have to count calories in order to track our intake. That can be extremely tiring, sometimes triggering for women to track their food. So there are other strategies that I use with my clients so that they don't have to track food all the time. But we need to make sure that we are eating generally around the amount so that we're not incidentally overeating. We want to watch what comes into our diet. So the other thing that we would pay attention to are our macros. So our macros are our carbs, our fat, our protein, and also alcohol. So like we mentioned before, 50 to 60 grams of protein a day is usually what women naturally sit at if they're not intentionally tracking their protein. So we would bump that up. We would almost double it over time. It can be really harsh on the stomach when we increase protein too quickly. So generally getting 0.07 grams to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight can be helpful. So I always just say a minimum of 100 grams a day can be really great to start with, and then we go from there. The next thing there, that's the nutrition piece, right? Make sure you get a baseline, make sure you actually know how much you're eating, get yourself in a deficit if you need to, and then we need to add progressive overload training. I call it a female-oriented progressive overload training, which is weightlifting, but more in a female-oriented way in that we're actually weightlifting in sync with our cycle. So with weightlifting, this is not Orange Theory, this is not Tracy Anderson. This is a really old school model of training actually, where we're tracking our sets and our reps, our weights, we're using compound movements, we're doing things like squats or overhead presses, push-up variations we do quite a bit, rows, these compound movements, and we're steadily tracking our weights and our reps. And we're fluctuating the intensity and programming the training properly so we're not stressing the body out, we're not doing too much, we're getting that Goldilocks effect so we're recovering properly from our training, and we're also waiving the intensity to make it work with our cycles. So we're progressing at the right amount so that you're actually recovering. We're not going through depleting workouts anymore, right? Like we're very strategic with the training. The next thing we'd want to add is a little bit of cardio. So cardio is not a bad word. We mentioned you don't want to be, doing Orange Theory and these crazy spin cycle classes, 3, 4, 5 times a week. That can actually start to deplete you, especially if you're training on top of that. What we want to do is more what I call parasympathetic cardio, things like some yoga, some dance, Pilates, some biking, gardening, things that feel good but are just increasing your activity levels, but are more restorative in nature. Walking is fantastic, so I consider parasympathetic cardio a little bit of a step above walking. It's still pretty low level, but it's not as low level as walking, but getting 8,000 to 10,000 steps a day can be fantastic as well. I like to start really slow. So if somebody has limited time, we start with just walking first, and then we start to add more on top of that, ramp up as needed. I just bought a walking pad on Amazon. So walking pads can be great. They're like $100 on Amazon, especially right now it's January. I'm in Florida, so the weather's not too harsh, but for somebody who's lived in Florida as long as I have, it's still cold here, sometimes in the 30s and 40s in the morning. So walking pads can be great to be able to get those steps in, and you don't have to go outside in the harsh weather. So again, to recap our winning strategy here, we want to make sure you're eating enough, get you in that calorie deficit, assuming you're eating enough, increase the protein, get on a female-oriented progressive overload training. Usually that's training somewhere around 3 to 4 times a week. My clients train 3 days a week because it's the most simple and straightforward. And then some parasympathetic cardio or getting some steps in. So it's not that complicated, right? Those basically 3 steps. I call it it's a blueprint. I call it the feminine strength blueprint. It's progressive overload training, eating for hormonal and metabolic health, and getting in that parasympathetic cardio. It doesn't have to be super complicated, but we do want to track. We do want to make sure we're measuring these things. We do want to make sure that we're staying accountable to the process. Because when women say, I can't lose weight because of my hormones, again, like I mentioned earlier, we say that they're not really noticing how much they're eating, they're not really tracking their activity levels, they're kind of winging it, which isn't going to work the same way that it did 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So if you're already tracking your food, you're following this blueprint and this method, you will see results. If they're not as quick as you want them to be, sometimes hormonal replacement therapy can be helpful, or other herbs and supplements that can be helpful, that can be prescribed by a doctor. Lifestyle changes can be really helpful, working on sleep hygiene, regulating the nervous system, saying no, setting boundaries. But essentially, what we really want to make sure is that you're consistent with those big rocks: the nutrition, the training, the daily movement, or the regular movement throughout the week. We cannot just wing it. We need to have some sort of plan, and then we start to actually see the results, and we can measure those results as well. So, final thoughts are, if you're over 40, nearing 40, and you have this goal to get toned, get clear about how much you're eating, get into the deficit, progressive overload training, move regularly, and track. Those are the big rocks. So if you are interested in having a more comprehensive plan, really straightforward, personalized, because again, we're all unique, we're all a little bit different. If you want to build muscle and lose fat simultaneously, you are more than welcome to check out our 6-month feminine strength program. It's comprehensive, but it's very straightforward. I've gotten great feedback of, there's so much here, but it's so easy to follow, and I know exactly where I'm supposed to go in order to move forward. Sometimes we come into these programs and these courses, and there's just so much information that we don't know where to start. This is, okay, here's where you go, step 1. Here's what it is, step 2, et cetera, and then of course I'm there the whole time in one-on-one sessions, or also messenger, right? So you're not just left. And as I mentioned earlier, the word of the episode is hamburger. If you collect these words, we'll give you a percentage off, that 10% off the Feminine Strength program. If you have any other questions, feel free to email me, and otherwise I will see you for our next episode. Thanks, guys.